In 1555, the Queen of England sat in a sealed room, rocking a cradle that would never hold a child. Her belly was swollen, her breasts were heavy with milk, and the entire kingdom was waiting for the cry of a prince. But deep inside her womb, something else was growing, something that wasn't human. For months, the most powerful woman in the world was held hostage by her own body in a medical nightmare that historians tried to dismiss as madness. But this was no simple delusion. It was a biological horror story that humiliated a dynasty and fueled a reign of terror. This is the tragedy of a woman trapped between a desperate prayer and a deadly lie. We are digging through the coldest graves of the past to find the stories that time tried to erase. It is a lonely journey into the shadows, and we cannot do it without you. If you have the stomach for the truth and want to help us keep these forgotten voices alive, please press that subscribe button right now. Let's step into the Queen's chamber together. Time was the one enemy Mary could not burn at the stake. By the summer of 1554, the new Queen of England was 37 years old. In the brutal calculus of the Tudor era, she was not just a mature woman, she was ancient, hovering at the very edge of her biological twilight. But Mary did not just need a child, she needed a miracle. The kingdom was fractured, torn apart by her father's heresy, and without a Catholic heir born of her own body, the crown would pass to her half-sister, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth represented everything Mary despised: Protestantism, illegitimacy, and the ghost of Anne Boleyn. To understand the horror that followed, you have to understand the trauma etched into Mary's bones. She had grown up watching a slow-motion tragedy in her own mother's bedchamber. Catherine of Aragon, Mary's mother, had been pregnant 6 times. 6 times the cannons were prepped, and 6 times the nurseries were decorated. But from those 6 pregnancies, only Mary survived. The others were black discolorations, stillbirths, and infants who gasped for air for a few weeks before turning cold. Mary had spent her youth dressed in mourning black, standing over tiny coffins. She lived in the shadow of a cursed womb, terrified that her bloodline was poisoned, that perhaps God simply did not want Tudors to reproduce. For years, her father, King Henry VIII, had weaponized this failure against her. He had stripped Mary of her title, declared her a bastard, and forced her to serve the infant Elizabeth as a maid. The stress of these years had ravaged Mary's physical health. Contemporary ambassadors described her as incredibly thin, plagued by severe headaches, and prone to long periods of melancholia. Her body was frail, hardened by years of stress and arguably starved of affection. But now she was queen. The crown was heavy on her brow, but the emptiness of her womb weighed more. She was convinced that God had saved her for a purpose, to restore the true faith to England. And to do that, she needed a son. It wasn't just a political necessity, it was a divine mandate. If she failed, the heretics won. This desperation created a dangerous psychological state. Mary wasn't just hoping for a baby. She was willing it into existence with every fibre of her being. She ignored her age. She ignored her frailty. She ignored the family history of obstetric disaster. She looked at her body not as a vessel of biology, but as an instrument of God. And when you believe God is scripting your life, you start to see signs where there are none. You start to believe that the impossible is inevitable. Mary was ready to perform her duty, but she needed a partner. She needed a king, and unfortunately for her, the man she chose would bring a coldness to her bed that no fire could warm. Into this atmosphere of frantic prayer entered Philip of Spain. He was 27 years old, a decade younger than his bride, and he arrived in England like a golden statue brought to life. He was the most eligible bachelor in Europe, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, and a man accustomed to the sun-drenched courts of the continent. When he landed in Southampton in July 1554, he brought with him the scent of power and the rigid, unyielding Catholicism that Mary craved. To the Queen, he was a saviour sent by heaven to vindicate her existence. But to Philip, Mary was not a wife. She was a strategic asset, a dreary political obligation that he had been ordered to endure by his father. The tragedy of their union began the moment they laid eyes on each other at Winchester. Mary, small, pale, and trembling with anxiety, looked at him with a hunger that was almost painful to witness. She saw a god. Philip, however, saw a decaying relic. In private letters sent back to Spain, the cruelty of his assessment is breathtaking. He and his entourage mocked her style of dress and her lack of eyebrows, a fashion of the time that merely made her look skull-like to the Spanish courtiers. Philip wrote to his closest advisor, Rui Gimez de Silva, describing the marriage not as a joyous union, but as a chalice he had to drink. He was swallowing a bitter poison for the good of the Habsburg Empire. This dynamic turned the royal bedchamber into a stage for a silent, suffocating horror. The wedding night, usually a subject of ribald celebration in the Tudor court, was a grim affair. We know from historical records that the palace was filled with tension. Mary was inexperienced, having lived a life of enforced virginity and fear. She approached the marriage bed with a terrifying mix of religious duty and desperate hope. She needed to conceive immediately. Every touch, every movement was laden with the weight of the future of England. Philip performed his duty with the cold efficiency of a soldier executing a maneuver. There was no passion, only the mechanical friction required to produce an heir. He played the part of the attentive husband in public, holding her hand and smiling for the crowds, but behind the heavy oak doors he was emotionally absent. He was physically repulsed by her, yet he had to lie with her, night after night, praying that his seed would take root so he could leave this rainy, miserable island. For Mary, this coldness went unnoticed, or perhaps she simply chose not to see it. She projected her own desires onto him, interpreting his silence as solemnity and his distance as royal dignity. She fell deeply, disastrously in love with a man who counted the minutes until he could escape her presence. This delusion was the soil in which the phantom pregnancy would grow. Mary felt loved, she felt safe, and for the first time in her life, she felt potential. Her mind was so desperate to please this cold, distant husband that it began to send signals to her body, commands that her biology was all too eager to obey. The stage was set for the body to lie. It began in September 1554, just weeks after the wedding festivities had faded into the damp English autumn. The first sign was silence. For the entirety of her adult life, Mary had been plagued by irregular and painful menstrual cycles, a source of constant anxiety. But suddenly, the blood stopped. The rhythm of her body, usually a reminder of her barrenness, ground to a halt. In the 16th century, without modern diagnostics, the cessation of the courses was the definitive, undeniable clockwork of conception. Mary waited. 1 week passed, then another. The silence continued. Then came the sickness. It wasn't a gentle fatigue. It was a violent, retching nausea that seized her in the mornings. To any other woman, this vomiting would have been a misery. To Mary, it was a benediction. Every wave of nausea was physical proof that God had answered her prayers. Her waistline, always slender and corseted tight, began to thicken. Her breasts became tender and heavy, the veins darkening under her translucent skin. The transformation was rapid, almost aggressive, as if her body was rushing to make up for lost time. The court physicians were summoned. These men, learned in the humours and the stars, examined the queen's urine and felt her abdomen. They saw the swelling, they saw the lack of blood, and crucially, they saw the terrifying hope in the queen's eyes. This is where the medical tragedy began to curdle into a conspiracy of silence. Even if a doctor suspected a tumour or a dropsy, a retention of fluid, who among them would dare tell Bloody Mary that her miracle was a disease? To deny the pregnancy was to deny the will of God and the future of the Catholic Church. And so, they nodded. They confirmed it. They told her exactly what she needed to hear. Simon Rennet, the imperial ambassador and the closest thing Mary had to a confidant, wrote hurriedly to Emperor Charles VIII. His letters from this period vibrate with cautious excitement. He reported that the Queen's stomach was clearly distended and that she was experiencing the usual signs, but the most chilling symptom was the sensation Mary herself reported. She felt life. She described the flutter, the quickening, the undeniable feeling of a child turning within her womb. Medically, this was the moment the trap snapped shut. The human mind is a powerful engine. Under extreme emotional duress, it can hijack the endocrine system. It can force the pituitary gland to secrete hormones that mimic pregnancy down to the cellular level. Mary wasn't lying. She wasn't faking it for attention. She was feeling the kick of a ghost. Her belief was so potent that it created a biological reality, a phantom inhabitant that took up residence in her womb. The news exploded out of the palace. The Queen was with child. The miracle had happened, and with that confirmation, the path to the cliff edge was set. If the swelling of Mary's belly was a personal tragedy, the reaction of her kingdom was a collective hallucination. The moment the physicians nodded their assent, the machinery of the Tudor state roared into life, fueled by a mixture of religious ecstasy and political terror. This was no longer just a medical case. It was a divine intervention. In November 1554, The highest clergy in the land gathered at St. Paul's Cathedral. The air, thick with incense and the smoke of wax candles, vibrated with the sound of the Te Deum, the ancient hymn of praise. They were thanking God for a child that did not exist. The bells of London rang out, pealing across the city, drowning out the whispers of the skeptics. The delusion was so potent it infected the law itself. In the halls of Parliament, the Lords and Commons gathered to pass one of the most dangerous pieces of legislation in English history. They drafted a specific Act of Regency. This document stated that if Queen Mary were to die in childbirth, a very real possibility given her age and health, her husband, Philip of Spain, would become the regent. He would hold the supreme power of England as the guardian of the infant. The English nobility, who notoriously hated foreigners and feared Spanish influence, was so intoxicated by the promise of this baby that they signed away the keys to the kingdom to a man they despised. They were gambling the sovereignty of the nation on a ghost. The confidence was absolute. Letters were drafted to foreign courts announcing the birth, leaving a blank space for the date, but barely considering the gender. It was assumed, with a terrifying arrogance, that the child would be a boy. God would not send a girl to save Catholicism. The nurseries at Hampton Court were renovated with a manic attention to detail. An intricate, carved cradle was commissioned, wrapped in gold and velvet, rocking empty in the firelight, waiting for the Saviour Prince. But amidst the bonfires and the hymns, there was a dark undercurrent. The stakes had been raised so high that failure was no longer an option. If Mary was wrong, she wouldn't just be an embarrassed woman. She would be a false prophet. She would be the queen who tricked her people. The entire legitimacy of her reign, and the Catholic restoration she fought for, was now physically tethered to the size of her waist. The build-up was a slow climb up a gallows. The higher the celebrations went, the more lethal the drop became. By the spring of 1555, the stage was perfectly set. The laws were passed, the prayers were sung, and the world was watching. Mary was ready to retreat into the shadows to claim her prize. In April 1555, the trap was finally sprung. Mary retreated to Hampton Court Palace, the sprawling red-brick fortress on the banks of the Thames, to prepare for the final stage of the performance. The lying in the 16th century, childbirth was viewed as a battle between life and death, a moment so perilous that the mother had to be sequestered from the world. But for Mary, this ritual would become a sentence of solitary confinement. She was escorted to the Queen's private apartments, and as the heavy oak doors thudded shut behind her, she effectively vanished from the earth. The protocol for a royal lying-in was rigid and terrifyingly specific. The goal was to recreate the conditions of the warm itself safe, warm and dark. But the reality was a sensory deprivation chamber. Heavy tapestries, woven with scenes of saints and martyrs, were nailed over the windows, blotting out the spring sunlight. The only illumination came from the flickering of candles, and the roaring hearths that were kept burning 24 hours a day, regardless of the temperature outside. The room was kept stiflingly hot, a practice believed to protect the infant from the bad air of the outside world. Inside this sweltering, twilight box, the air grew thick with the smell of wood smoke, beeswax, and the cloying scent of herbal rushes scattered on the floor. Mary was surrounded only by her ladies in waiting, a circle of women who watched her every move with a mixture of reverence and anxiety. The world of men, the politics, the ambassadors, even her husband Philip was barred from entering. Mary was left alone with her thoughts, her prayers, and the growing distortion of her own body. This environment was the worst possible place for a woman suffering from a phantom pregnancy. Isolated from reality, stripped of her duties, and forced to focus entirely on her physical sensations, Mary's mind spiraled inward. In the darkness, time lost its meaning. Every cramp, every gurgle of digestion, every shift of her weight was amplified into a sign from God. She spent her days rocking in the heat, speaking to the child she believed was imminent. The psychological pressure in that room was crushing. Outside those draped windows, the entire machinery of the state had paused. Couriers were stationed at the gates, ready to ride to the corners of Europe with the news. The bedding was prepared. The wet nurses, chosen for the quality of their milk, were waiting in the antechambers. Mary was sitting in the center of a loaded weapon. If she did not produce a child, the humiliation would be absolute. The darkness of the room mirrored the darkness closing in on her mind. She was no longer just a queen. She was a prisoner of her own biology, waiting for a release that nature had no intention of granting. Into this stifling, candlelit void stepped the royal physicians. These men, Dr. Owen, Dr. Wendy, and Dr. Hugh were the most learned medical minds in England. But in the spring of 1555, they were walking a tightrope over a pit of spikes. Their job was ostensibly to monitor the health of the Queen and the progress of the heir. In reality, they were tasked with validating a miracle that their scientific minds were beginning to doubt. To diagnose a monarch was always a dangerous game. To diagnose Bloody Mary with a forced pregnancy was a potential death sentence. The examination of a queen was not a physical intrusion. It was a distant, ceremonial dance. They could not simply prod and poke the sovereign's body at will. Instead, they relied on observation and the analysis of the royal water, the queen's urine. Every morning, flasks of amber liquid were held up to the light, swirled, and inspected for sediment, cloudiness, and colour. In Tudor medicine, this was the primary window into the body's humours. They looked for the signs of a thriving fetus. What they likely found instead were the markers of a body in distress, perhaps the proteins of a failing system or the hormonal chaos of a pituitary malfunction. But the most terrifying moments came when they were permitted to touch her. Reports suggest they felt the distension of her abdomen. A healthy pregnancy feels firm, like a ripe fruit. But Mary's belly may have felt different, perhaps spongy with fluid, a condition known as dropsy, or hard and unyielding like a tumour. They would have noted the lack of the feet or heartbeat, which, by this late stage, should have been strong enough to hear with an ear pressed against the linen. They listened for the rhythm of a new life, and the silence that greeted them must have been deafening. Here lies the true horror of their position. These men were not fools. By May, they must have known. The dates didn't align. The physical symptoms were contradictory. The baby had not dropped. Yet, they looked at the Queen, a woman desperate, emotional, and wielding the power to burn heretics, and they chose survival. They chose to lie. When Mary asked if everything was well, they assured her it was perfect. When she complained of pain, they called it growing pains. They became accomplices in the delusion because the alternative was treason. To suggest the Queen was merely sick, or worse, barren, would be to strike a blow against the Catholic Restoration. So, the charade continued. They prescribed rich diets to strengthen the child, which likely only increased Mary's weight and fueled the illusion of growth. They nodded solemnly as she described movements that were likely nothing more than intestinal spasms. In that hot, airless room, science bowed its head to fear. The doctors essentially gaslit the Queen, reinforcing the phantom pregnancy until it became an unassailable fact. They were guarding a secret that was growing more dangerous with every passing hour. They knew the clock was ticking, and they were simply praying that nature would intervene before the truth had to be spoken. While Mary lay in the suffocating silence of her chamber, the world outside was screaming. The spring of 1555 was not a season of peace. It was a season of fire. To understand the terrifying weight placed on this unborn child, you have to look at the smoke rising over London. This was the height of the Marian persecutions. While the Queen waited for a life to begin, she was busy ending hundreds of others. At Smithfield, just miles from where the cradle waited, Protestants were being chained to the stakes and burned alive for heresy. The atmosphere in England was electric with a morbid polarization. The country was split down the middle, held together only by the suspense of the pregnancy. For the Catholics, this baby was the Messiah. They gathered in the parish churches, whispering frantic prayers, believing that a Catholic heir would finally wash away the sins of Henry VIII and cement the return to Rome forever. To them, Mary's swollen belly was the ark of their salvation. If she gave birth to a son, the Protestant Reformation in England would be buried in the ash heap of history. But for the Protestants, who were hiding in cellars or fleeing to the continent, the pregnancy was a potential apocalypse. They weren't praying for a safe delivery. They were praying for death. In secret meetings and coded letters, they whispered dark hopes that the Queen would die in labour, or that the child would be stillborn. They knew that if a healthy Catholic prince took his first breath, their course was last for generations. The phantom in Mary's womb was the most political fetus in European history. The tension spilled into the streets. Betting shops in London were taking wagers on the gender and the date of birth. Foreign merchants reported that the city felt like a powder keg. Rumours flew faster than the wind could carry them. One day, a whisper would tear through the markets that the Queen had died. The next, that she had birthed a monster. The next, that twins had arrived. The uncertainty was maddening. and hanging over it all was the terrifying question of legitimacy. Everyone knew that Philip was packing his bags. The Spanish king was growing restless, and his advisers were already mocking the English weather and the English people. The people saw the burnings, they saw the foreign king, and they saw a queen who had vanished into a dark room. The connection between the queen's body and the body politic was absolute. If her body failed, the state would fracture. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and the sweat of anxiety. England was holding its breath, waiting for a cry that would either save the soul of the nation or damn it to chaos. On the April 30th, 1555, the tension finally snapped. A rumour, born from nowhere, struck London like a lightning bolt. No one knows exactly who started it, perhaps a servant misinterpreting a cry from the Queen's chamber, or a desperate courier trying to earn a tip, but the word spread that the wait was over. The Queen had been delivered, and it was a boy. The reaction was instantaneous and hysterical. The city of London, which had been holding its breath for 9 months, exhaled in a roar of celebration. Church bells began to peal, one parish triggering the next until the entire capital was drowning in a cacophony of iron and bronze. In the streets, people piled furniture, wood, and refuse into great heaps and lit bonfires that turned the night sky orange. Tables were dragged out onto the cobblestones, and wine flowed freely. The Venetian ambassador, Giovanni Michel, watched from his window in disbelief, recording that the joy was incredible. The Te Deum was sung yet again in the cathedrals. Even across the Channel in Flanders, the news arrived, and cannons were fired in salute to the new English prince. But while the city partied, the atmosphere inside Hampton Court was one of frozen horror. The Queen was not in labour. She was merely in pain. The cramping that had sparked the rumour was just that, cramping. Perhaps it was indigestion, or the phantom contractions of a uterus fighting a battle against nothing. The windows of the Queen's chamber remained dark, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the glare of the bonfires burning outside. The messengers had to be sent out, riding hard against the tide of celebration, to kill the joy they had just unleashed. Slowly, agonizingly, the truth trickled back into the city. The bells stopped ringing one by one. The fires were allowed to burn down to embers. The singing died in the throats of the clergy. The realization hit the public with the force of a physical blow. It was a lie. There was no prince. There was no birth. There was only a sick woman in a dark room. The humiliation was total. The French ambassador, Antoine de Noailles, who had always been skeptical, wrote with dripping sarcasm about the midwives and old women who controlled the kingdom. The English people felt foolish, having spent their emotions and their wine on a phantom. And for Mary, hearing the cheers turn to silence must have been the cruelest cut of all. She had heard her people loving her for a moment, only to have to snatch that love away. The false alarm didn't just break the tension, it broke the spell. The hope began to curdle into something dark, a suspicion. The date of delivery had come and gone. The wind that the ambassadors had whispered about was beginning to look like the only thing the Queen was carrying. May turned into June. June bled into July. The spring flowers in the gardens of Hampton Court bloomed and died. Yet inside the sealed chamber, time had frozen. By all medical logic, the pregnancy was now in its 10th and 11th month. A human gestation is finite. Nature has a deadline. But Mary, I was fighting a war against reality. Following the humiliation of the false alarm, a rational mind might have accepted the truth. Mary, however, retreated deeper into the fortress of her delusion. She refused to leave her room. She refused to see the ambassadors. She simply moved the finish line. She told her ladies that they had miscalculated. She claimed the doctors were wrong about the conception date. She grasped at every old wives' tale and astrological chart to justify the delay. It wasn't late, she insisted. It was simply a slow child. But the atmosphere inside the room had shifted from anticipation to a heavy, suffocating pity. The imperial ambassador, Simon Rennet, who had once written with such hope, now sent dispatches that read like obituaries. He described the Queen sitting for hours on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, weeping silently on a cushion. The image is haunting. The most powerful woman in Christendom, reduced to a trembling, broken figure in the semi-darkness, waiting for a pain that would never come. Then, the physical horror took a new turn. The body can only sustain a phantom pregnancy for so long before the hormone tide breaks. Slowly, terrifyingly, the miracle began to dissolve. The swelling in her abdomen, which had been so convincing that it fooled seasoned physicians, began to recede. The tension in her breasts vanished. The baby was not being born. It was evaporating. Imagine the psychological terror of that experience. To wake up every morning and feel the life you prayed for literally shrinking away. to look in the mirror and see the flatness returning to your stomach.
Mary tried to hide it. She tightened her bodices.
She wore looser robes.
She clung to the physical symptoms even as they abandoned her. She spoke of movements even as her belly collapsed.
It was a slow-motion grief, a death without a body. The court watched this decay with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. The silence in the palace halls was no longer respectful. It was awkward.
Everyone knew.
The wet nurses began to pack their bags. The cradle rockers stopped their rhythmic motion. But no one dared to be the first to say the words. They let the queen sit in the ruins of her hope, surrounding her with a wall of polite lies, while outside the gates, the whispers were turning into something much uglier.
The people were done waiting.
They were starting to invent their own explanations for the empty cradle, and those explanations were not about miracles, they were about monsters. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the mob. As the queen's belly shrank, the silence from the palace was filled by the roar of the London streets.
The people of England had been promised a miracle, and when it failed to appear, their disappointment curdled into vicious paranoia.
If there was no baby, they reasoned, then the queen must be planning a fraud.
The summer of 1555 became the season of the conspiracy theory, and the rumours that circulated were not just cruel, they were treasonous.
The most pervasive story was the supposititious child. In the alehouses and markets, men whispered that Mary was never pregnant at all. They claimed she was desperate to secure a Catholic heir to block Elizabeth from the throne and had feigned the entire condition.
The theory went that her agents were scouring the countryside, looking for a newborn peasant boy changing to smuggle into Hampton Court.
The specifics of the rumours were vividly detailed. Some claimed the baby would be brought in a warming pan, hidden between the brass sheets used to heat the bed. Others said a basket of laundry would conceal the impostor. But the rumours grew darker and more grotesque. The Protestant opposition, sensing blood in the water, weaponized the gossip.
Seditious pamphlets began to appear, nailed to church doors or dropped in the mud. They suggested that the Queen had given birth to something, but it wasn't human. Stories spread that she had birthed a monkey or a dog, or a shapeless mass of gristle, a divine punishment for her burning of the martyrs.
The French ambassador, Antoine de Noailles, fed these flames with glee, writing to his masters in Paris about the comedy playing out in the English court.
He reported the wildest slander as if it were fact, delighting in the humiliation of England-Spanish alliance.
This wasn't just idle gossip, it was a political weapon.
By dehumanizing the Queen, by turning her personal tragedy into a grotesque joke, her enemies stripped her of her sanctity. A queen who births a prince is the mother of the nation. A queen who is rumoured to be smuggling peasant babies or birthing monsters is a tyrant losing her grip. The aura of divine right that protected Mary was shattering.
Inside the palace, the walls could not keep the whispers out. Mary knew what they were saying.
She knew that if she produced a child now, even if by some miracle, she actually went into labour, half the country would call it a fake. She had waited too long. The window of credibility had slammed shut.
She was trapped in a nightmare where even a genuine success would be treated as a crime. The public had turned on her, transforming her from a figure of sympathy into a character in a dark, twisted folklore.
She was no longer the Virgin Mother.
She was the barren witch of the fairy tales, and the ending of her story was being written by her enemies.
While Mary was fighting the ghosts in her mind, Philip of Spain was fighting the cold, hard math of politics. He was the first to stop pretending.
Philip was a Habsburg, a man bred to value dynasties over feelings, and by July 1555, he had run the numbers.
The swelling had gone down.
The labour had never started. The miracle was a medical impossibility.
He didn't need a doctor to tell him the truth.
He could see it with his own eyes.
The investment had failed, and like any ruthless investor, Philip decided it was time to cut his losses and liquidate his assets.
The betrayal began in the quiet corners of the palace.
Philip stopped visiting the Queen's bedside to hold her hand and pray.
Instead, his chambers became a flurry of activity not for a christening, but for a departure. Trunks were packed, servants were dismissed. The Spanish fleet was ordered to prepare for a channel crossing. He told Mary he was needed in Flanders to fight the French, a convenient excuse that both of them knew was a half-truth.
He was fleeing the scene of the crime. He could not bear the humiliation of being the father of a non-existent child. He wanted to be as far away as possible when the official announcement was made.
But the physical abandonment was nothing compared to the political knife he twisted in her back. Philip realized that if Mary died childless, the crown would pass to her half-sister, Elizabeth. For years, Mary had viewed Elizabeth as a heretic and a bastard, keeping her under house arrest, effectively a prisoner.
Mary wanted her gone.
But Philip, with ice in his veins, realized that Elizabeth was now his best option.
If Mary couldn't give him an heir, perhaps he could forge an alliance or even a future marriage with the sister. In a move of stunning callousness, Philip intervened to protect Elizabeth.
He pressured Mary to release her from house arrest.
He sent his own envoys to charm the Protestant princess. While his wife was sitting in a darkened room, weeping over an empty cradle, Philip was effectively courting her rival. He was hedging his bets.
To Mary, who worshipped him, this shift must have been shattering.
She wasn't just losing her baby.
She was watching her husband align himself with the very woman who represented the death of her Catholic dream. The emotional distance between them became a chasm. Philip's letters to his father, the Emperor, from this period are devoid of sympathy. He speaks of the uncertainty and the need to attend to other business. He was washing his hands of the English disaster.
When he finally came to say his goodbyes, the dynamic was pitiful.
Mary clung to him, believing his promise that he would return in a few weeks.
Philip nodded, bowed, and walked out the door, likely knowing he would stay away for years. He left a broken woman alone in a nursery that would never hear a cry, surrounded by courtiers who were already looking past her, toward the rising sun of Elizabeth. August 1555 brought the end, not with a bang, but with a suffocating whimper.
The summer heat in the closed rooms of Hampton Court had become unbearable, a physical manifestation of the fever dream that had gripped the palace for months. Finally, the realization became too heavy to ignore. The doctors stopped their daily inspections.
The prayers in the chapel trailed off.
The charade had run its course. It was time to open the doors. The lying-in ended without a birth. Mary emerged from her self-imposed imprisonment, blinking into the harsh light of reality. The transformation was shocking. She had entered the room a radiant, expectant mother, convinced of her divine selection.
She left it a ghost. Witnesses described her as looking years older, her face gaunt, her frame thin and frail, the swelling completely gone as if it had been punctured.
There was no bundle in her arms.
There was no air trailing behind her. There was just a small, middle-aged woman walking through a corridor of silent courtiers who couldn't bear to meet her eyes.
The dismantling of the dream was a logistical operation as much as an emotional one. The dissolution of the royal nursery was a bureaucratic act of violence. The ornate cradle, carved with such hope and draped in gold cloth, was stripped and moved to storage, a relic of a prince who never was.
The rockers the wet nurses and attendants hired to care for the infant were paid their wages and dismissed.
These women, who had sat by the empty crib for months, packed their bags and walked out of the palace gates, taking the last shred of credibility with them.
The court moved quickly to scrub the memory. They packed up the entire household and fled Hampton Court, the scene of the crime, retreating to the smaller palace of Oaklands. It was a flight from humiliation.
As the royal barge drifted down the Thames, away from the red brick towers where Mary had spent her months of darkness, the silence was absolute. No one spoke of the baby.
It was as if the last 9 months had been collectively erased from the record. But for Mary, the walk of shame didn't end at the palace gates.
She had to face her subjects. She had to break through crowds that had once cheered for her quickening, and now stared with a mixture of pity and contempt.
She had to sit on a throne next to an empty space where a king consort should have been, and look out at a nobility that was already calculating the days until her death. She had gambled her body, her sanity, and her reputation on a miracle, and she had lost everything. The phantom pregnancy was over, but the haunting of Mary Tudor was just beginning. She wasn't just a queen without an heir.
She was a woman who had been betrayed by her own flesh. If the first phantom pregnancy was a tragedy, the second was a descent into madness.
2 years passed.
The calendar turned to 1557. England was poorer, the burnings were fiercer, and the Queen was dying by inches.
Then, unexpectedly, the ghost returned.
Philip, who had been absent for nearly 2 years, returned to England. He didn't come for love.
He came for war. He needed English money and English soldiers to fight the French. But for Mary, his arrival was a resurrection. For 4 brief months, they were husband and wife again. And when Philip left in July, taking his troops with him, Mary was convinced he had left something else behind.
The symptoms began again with terrifying precision. The cessation of blood, the morning nausea, the swelling of the abdomen.
It was a cruel echo of 1555, a muscle memory of a body that refused to accept defeat.
Mary announced that she was with child. She calculated the dates. She prepared the nursery.
She fell to her knees and thanked God for giving her a second chance to save her soul. But this time, the silence from the world was absolute. There were no bells. There were no bonfires. There were no Te Deums sung in St.
Pause.
The court had learned its lesson. The ambassadors looked at the queen's distended stomach and saw only a tomb. They wrote home not of a coming prince, but of a queen who had lost her grip on reality. The tragedy of 1558 was not the suspense.
It was the isolation. In 1555, the whole world had deluded itself with her. Now, she was deluding herself alone.
The most heartbreaking evidence of this period lies in the letters. Mary sat in her chambers, writing frantically to Philip in Flanders. She told him of the fluttering movements.
She described how the child was strong. She begged him, with a desperation that bleeds through the ink, to return for the birth. She believed that if he would just come back, if he would just stand by the bedside, the baby would come.
She was bargaining with the universe. Philip didn't come.
He didn't even pretend to believe her.
He read the letters and likely threw them into the fire. He knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had moved on, that there was no baby.
He sent polite, vague excuses. The movements Mary felt were dismissed by his doctors as the workings of a diseased uterus or the twitching of a dying body.
The days turned into weeks.
The due date arrived in March 1558, then April, then May.
The cycle of 1555 repeated itself, but stripped of all hope.
The swelling remained, but it was hard and painful now.
The queen walked the halls of St.
James's palace like a spectre, clutching a belly that was slowly killing her, waiting for a husband who was never coming back.
She was haunting her own life. So, what was actually growing inside the queen? For centuries, historians dismissed Mary simply as a hysterical woman whose desperate mind tricked her body. The medical term is pseudopsoriasis forced pregnancy.
It is a rare and powerful psychosomatic condition where extreme emotional stress forces the brain to hijack the endocrine system. The pituitary gland floods the body with hormones, distending the abdomen, stopping the menstrual cycle, and even stimulating the mammary glands to produce milk.
In this theory, Mary's grief was so potent it literally reshaped her flesh. She wanted a child so badly that her body built a stage for a play that had no actor.
But modern pathology suggests a darker, more physical culprit.
Many medical historians now believe Mary was suffering from a prolactinoma, a tumor on the pituitary gland. This diagnosis fits the puzzle pieces of her suffering with terrifying precision. A pituitary tumor presses against the optic chiasm, which explains the blinding headaches and failing eyesight Mary complained of for years.
Crucially, this type of tumor secretes prolactin, the hormone responsible for milk production and the cessation of menstruation. It wasn't just madness, it was a malignancy.
The fluttering she felt wasn't a baby kicking.
It was likely the spasms of a diseased uterus or the shifting of fluid caused by ovarian cysts.
The swelling that the court bowed to was likely dropsy, an archaic term for edema, the accumulation of fluid in the body's cavities, often a sign of heart or kidney failure.
In 1558, the swelling didn't recede like it had the first time.
It hardened. The baby she was cradling was likely a massive ovarian cyst or a tumor consuming her reproductive organs.
The irony is cruel. The very parts of her body she needed to save her dynasty were the ones that were killing her.
She was dying of her own femininity.
The pain became excruciating, keeping her bedridden, drifting in and out of consciousness. The doctors, who had once looked for a heartbeat, now looked at a dying woman and realized there was nothing they could do. The pregnancy was terminal.
By November 1558, the silence in the Queen's chamber was the silence of a tomb. The swelling in her body had not birthed a life.
It was consuming hers. Mary drifted in and out of a feverish delirium, her body racked by what records call an intermittent fever, likely a virulent strain of influenza that was sweeping through London, attacking a system already destroyed by the phantom pregnancy. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the political torture she was about to endure.
The time for delusions was over.
The Privy Council gathered around the bedside, not to comfort a dying woman, but to extract a confession of failure. They needed a name. The succession was the only thing that mattered now.
If Mary died without naming an heir, England would plunge into civil war, and there was only one name left to give: Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn.
The Protestant bastard whom Mary had imprisoned, threatened, and loathed for her entire adult life.
Elizabeth was the living embodiment of everything Mary had fought to destroy.
To name Elizabeth as queen was to admit that the burning of the heretics, the Spanish marriage, and the desperate prayers for a child had all been for nothing. It was to sign the death warrant of her own legacy.
The scene around the deathbed was brutal in its pragmatism. As Mary lay gasping for breath, her eyes clouding over, She could likely hear the sounds of horses being saddled in the courtyard below.
Her courtiers, her advisers, and even her closest friends were already packing their bags. They were preparing to ride north to Hatfield House, where Elizabeth was waiting. They were abandoning the setting sun to worship the rising one. The loyalty of the court evaporated before the Queen's heart had even stopped beating.
On November 6th, the council pushed her to the edge.
They demanded she formally designate her sister. Mary, too weak to fight and perhaps too broken to care, finally acquiesced. She whispered her consent, but with a final, desperate stipulation. She made Elizabeth promise to maintain the Catholic faith. It was a pathetic, hollow request.
Mary must have known, even as the words left her lips, that Elizabeth would dismantle everything the moment the crown touched her head.
The child that Mary had carried for all those years, the hope of a Catholic England, died in that moment.
She wasn't passing the torch to her successor. She was handing the keys of the kingdom to the enemy. The phantom pregnancy had not just broken her body. It had stalled the government for years, distracted the crown, and allowed the Protestant resistance to harden.
By trying so desperately to birth a saviour, Mary had inadvertently paved the way for the Virgin Queen. The surrender was absolute.
She turned her face to the wall, a woman who had been conquered not by an army, but by the biology she could not command.
On the morning of November 17, 1558, the swelling finally stopped.
Mary Tudor died at the age of 42.
But the horror of her reign did not die with her.
History has branded her Bloody Mary, a caricature of evil who burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake.
But when you overlay the medical timeline with the political one, a disturbing pattern emerges. The burnings didn't happen at random.
They spiked in intensity exactly when her pregnancies were failing. Psychologists and historians now argue that Mary's cruelty was born of a terrifying, twisted logic.
She believed her empty womb was a direct judgment from God. She thought she was being punished because she had not cleansed England thoroughly enough. In her fevered mind, God was withholding the heir because she was tolerating heresy.
So, every time the baby failed to appear, she lit another fire.
She was trying to bribe the Almighty with the smoke of heretics.
The bloody reign was, in essence, a desperate, violent attempt to induce labour.
She was burning her people to save her unborn child.
Her legacy is one of the most tragic ironies in English history.
She sacrificed her reputation, her happiness, and her people's lives for a Catholic heir.
Yet, she was succeeded by Elizabeth I, who reigned for 45 glorious years and established England as a Protestant powerhouse.
Mary's entire struggle was erased in a single generation.
Her name became a curse, whispered in nursery rhymes and urban legends, stripped of the human context of her suffering.
She became a monster in a mirror, not a grieving mother. But the final insult lies in Westminster Abbey. If you visit the royal vault today, you will find a magnificent tomb. Inside, 2 coffins lie side by side, stacked in the darkness. Mary is buried in the same narrow vault as Elizabeth. The Latin inscription on their shared tomb reads, "Partners both in throne and grave, here rest we 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection. In death, she is trapped for eternity with the very rival she spent her life trying to defeat. The woman who wanted a family more than anything ended up with nothing but a cold stone slab, and a sister who despised her."
The phantom pregnancy didn't just kill her children, it killed her memory.
Mary Tudor is not remembered as the mother she tried so hard to be.
She is remembered only as the queen who burned,